Have you ever caught yourself thinking about your own thinking? That strange moment when you realize there's an observer observing the observer? You've just stumbled onto one of the most revolutionary transformations in human consciousness, one that fundamentally changed how we experience reality itself. What if I told you that this capacity for self-reflection wasn't always part of human consciousness? That it emerged at a specific point in history, transforming everything about how humans understood themselves, the ultimate source, be it called God or otherwise, and their place in the cosmos. Picture ancient Greece for a moment. When Plato contemplated justice or Aristotle analyzed nature, they experienced thoughts as something received, like light entering the eye or sound reaching the ear. Thought was a perception, a gift from the cosmos that the soul could receive if properly attuned. But something profound happened between the fall of Rome and the rise of medieval Europe. A new form of consciousness was stirring, something that would both illuminate and complicate the human experience forever. This is the story of when the I found its voice, and why understanding this transformation might be the key to navigating our own consciousness evolution today. Rudolf Steiner observed something remarkable about this period. He wrote, "As in Greek times thought entered into the human soul, extinguishing the formerly prevalent picture consciousness, so, during the Middle Ages, the consciousness of the ego penetrated the human soul, and this dampened the vividness of thought. The Greeks had developed thinking as a new organ of perception. They could contemplate universal principles and discover cosmic truths, but they still experienced thought as something that flowed through them, connecting them to divine reason itself. The medieval transformation was more radical than anything the Greeks had experienced. For the first time in human history, consciousness began to experience itself as the producer of thoughts rather than their receiver. The I emerged not just as a thinking being, but as the one who knows it thinks. This shift created an unprecedented situation. Humans became self-aware in a way that separated them from the very cosmic intelligence they had previously participated in. The ego was born, not as a limitation, but as a new evolutionary capacity that came with both gifts and challenges. The first clear voice of this new consciousness appears in St. Augustine in the 4th century. More than 1,000 years before Descartes would declare, "I think, therefore I am," Augustine made an identical discovery. Augustine realized, even if I doubt everything else, I cannot doubt that I am doubting. Even if everything I perceive is illusion, I cannot deny the reality of the one perceiving the illusion. But Augustine experienced this self-awareness differently than later philosophers would. For him, this ego consciousness wasn't a triumph of human reason, it was a spiritual problem. This new capacity created what felt like a barrier between the soul and God that hadn't existed before. The Greeks could think cosmic thoughts because they participated in cosmic intelligence, but St. Augustine discovered a thinking self that stood apart, observing its own operations. This observer was undeniably real, but it seemed isolated from the divine unity previous generations had taken for granted. Modern neuroscience offers a fascinating perspective on what St. Augustine was experiencing. When researchers study the brain's default mode network, the neural system associated with self-referential thinking, they find that increased activity in this network often correlates with decreased access to transcendent states of consciousness. St. Augustine had discovered this experientially 13 centuries before we could map it on brain scans. The very faculty that grants self-awareness can simultaneously wall us off from direct spiritual perception. This emerging ego consciousness created a crisis that would define medieval philosophy. If I'm the one producing my thoughts, how do I know they connect to anything real? If consciousness has become self-enclosed, how can it know truth about the world beyond itself? The Greeks never faced this problem because they experienced thinking as cosmic participation. But once humans became aware of themselves as the authors of their thoughts, the question of truth became desperately personal. This wasn't mere philosophical speculation. It was an existential crisis affecting how people understood their relationship to reality, to each other, and to the divine. The birth of ego consciousness was simultaneously the birth of fundamental doubt about whether the mind could know anything beyond its own operations. Enter Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, perhaps the most systematic thinker of the entire medieval period. Aquinas attempted something extraordinary, to create a complete integration of Aristotelian philosophy with Christian revelation, while accounting for this new ego consciousness. Aquinas argued that human reason could accomplish remarkable things. It could understand the natural world, prove God's existence through logical argument, and even grasp fundamental truths about the soul's nature. But there was a hard limit. Aquinas taught, man could not know how his own being stands in the course of the world if the spirit being, to which his knowledge does not penetrate, did not deign to reveal to him what must remain concealed to a knowledge relying on its own power alone. This wasn't intellectual humility. It was precise phenomenological observation. Aquinas had mapped the exact boundary where ego consciousness encounters its own limitations. The more self-aware we become, the more we realize we cannot think our way to ultimate truth through rational analysis alone. Aquinas created what became known as the two-story universe, reason operating in the natural realm below, divine revelation illuminating spiritual truths above. To modern secular thinking, this appears to artificially limit human reason and create unnecessary divisions. But Aquinas was actually documenting something profound about the structure of consciousness itself. The same faculty that grants us self-awareness also creates a kind of cognitive enclosure. We can observe our own thinking processes, but this very ability to stand apart and observe can disconnect us from the immediate reality we're trying to understand. The emergence of ego consciousness sparked one of the most important debates in Western philosophy, the conflict between realists and nominalists. At stake was nothing less than whether human thinking could access universal truths or was forever trapped in its own mental constructions. The realists, led by thinkers like Anselm of Canterbury, argued that universal concepts have real existence. When you think dog, you're not just creating a mental category, you're perceiving something real that exists in a spiritual dimension. All individual dogs participate in this universal dogness. If realism is true, then human thinking connects us to actual spiritual realities. Our concepts aren't just useful fictions, but windows into higher truth. The ego, despite its apparent isolation, maintains connection to cosmic intelligence through the reality of universal ideas. The nominalists, like Roscelin and later William of Ockham, disagreed fundamentally. Those universal concepts are just names. Nominalism comes from the Latin nomen, meaning name. Only individual things are real. The concept dog is just a convenient label your mind creates. If nominalism is true, then ego consciousness is radically cut off from spiritual reality. We're trapped in our own mental constructions with no guarantee they connect to anything beyond our individual minds. This debate continues today in new forms. When artificial intelligence researchers ask whether machines can truly understand or just simulate understanding, they're walking the same philosophical ground as these medieval thinkers. When neuroscientists debate whether consciousness is fundamental or emergent, they're engaging the same core questions about the relationship between mind and reality. While philosophers debated the status of concepts, the mystics took a different approach. If ego consciousness created a barrier to direct spiritual experience, perhaps the solution was learning to transcend the ego itself, not through destruction, but through skillful transcendence. The great medieval mystics, Meister Eckhart, Johannes Tauler, Heinrich Suso, developed sophisticated technologies for moving beyond ego consciousness while maintaining awareness. They discovered that the same capacity for self-reflection that could trap consciousness in self-enclosed thinking could also be used to transcend those limitations. Eckhart expressed this beautifully. God is nearer to me than I am to myself. But to experience this divine nearness, the ego self had to learn when to step aside. Not destruction of the I, but its conscious surrender to something greater. The anonymous author of the German Theology described the process precisely. The soul must become completely composed, surrendered in tranquility, patiently waiting to be filled with the divine ego. Notice the sophistication here. The mystics weren't trying to eliminate ego consciousness, but to create space for a higher form of selfhood to emerge. They were pioneers of what we might now call integral awareness, the capacity to move fluidly between different modes of consciousness as circumstances require. One of the most innovative responses to the medieval consciousness crisis came from Nicholas of Cusa in the 15th century. Cusa developed what he called learned ignorance, a precise spiritual technology that used ego consciousness itself as a gateway to transcendence. Since thinking creates a barrier to ultimate truth, Cusa reasoned, the wisest approach is to consciously embrace not knowing. But this isn't intellectual surrender, it's strategic use of reason's own power. The mind must transcend itself, Cusa taught. not by abandoning reason, but by reasoning so deeply that reason itself points beyond reason. Cusa had discovered something profound about the structure of consciousness. When thinking is pushed to its absolute limits, when every concept is exhausted and every analysis reaches its boundary, a natural opening appears. In that space of learned ignorance, transcendent insight becomes possible. This is remarkably similar to what contemporary neuroscience reveals about breakthrough moments in creativity and problem solving. Brain imaging shows that insights often emerge precisely when analytical thinking networks quiet down, creating space for other neural systems to activate. Paracelsus in the 16th century took medieval consciousness exploration in a radically new direction. Instead of fleeing the material world for pure spirit, he dove deeper into nature itself, but nature understood as ensouled, alive with its own intelligence. Paracelsus sought what he called the light of nature, a form of knowing that emerged when ego consciousness became permeable to nature's own wisdom. One must be capable of receiving something from nature that one does not create oneself as thought during the act of observation, he insisted. This anticipates what we now understand about altered states of consciousness in natural settings. When the ego's constant narrative activity quiets down, consciousness can perceive dimensions of reality that analytical thinking cannot access. Modern research on flow states, nature mysticism, and even plant medicine experiences all point to what Paracelsus intuited, that ego consciousness doesn't have to be a prison. It can become a permeable membrane through which greater intelligences communicate. The culmination of medieval consciousness exploration appears in Jakob Boehme, a simple shoemaker who experienced profound illuminations in the early 17th century. Boehme saw the entire cosmic drama of fall and redemption playing out within human consciousness itself. For Boehme, the emergence of ego consciousness wasn't a tragic mistake, but a necessary stage in cosmic evolution. The ego experiences itself as separate precisely so it can consciously choose reunion with its source. The evil in the world is opposed to the good as its counterpart. It is only in the evil that the good becomes aware of itself, as the ego becomes aware of itself in its inner soul experiences. This represents sophisticated spiritual psychology. Boehme understood that consciousness requires opposition to know itself. The ego needs to experience separation in order to make reunion meaningful. Shadow makes light recognizable. Jakob Boehme was mapping what depth psychology would later call individuation, the process by which consciousness differentiates itself from unconscious unity, then consciously reintegrates at a higher level. Today's consciousness researchers are rediscovering what medieval thinkers mapped through direct experience. The predictive processing model in neuroscience shows how the brain constructs reality through constant prediction and error correction, exactly what Aquinas suggested about the mind's relationship to truth. Studies on metacognition reveal dedicated neural networks for self-reflection. We literally have brain circuits that evolved to support the kind of self-awareness Augustine discovered. Research on flow states, mystical experiences, and psychedelics confirms what medieval mystics knew experientially about transcending ego consciousness while maintaining awareness. The capacity for these states is built into our neural architecture. The medieval contemplatives had found reproducible methods for accessing them. These medieval insights translate directly into practical techniques for contemporary consciousness exploration. The Augustine mirror. Throughout the day, pause randomly and simply notice. Who is aware right now? Don't analyze, just rest in the immediate recognition of being the one who notices. This builds familiarity with pure self-awareness before thought elaborates. The Aquinas balance. For any life question, first think it through rationally and thoroughly. Then set analysis aside and open to intuitive knowing. Practice switching consciously between these different modes of intelligence. Learned ignorance practice. Choose something you think you understand well. Systematically explore everything you don't know about it until your understanding breaks down into mystery. Rest in that not knowing spaciously, rather than frantically trying to fill it with concepts. The nominalist test. Pick a universal concept like beauty or justice. Find 3 wildly different examples in your immediate environment. What makes them all instances of the same thing? Experience firsthand the mystery that consumed medieval philosophers. We're living through our own consciousness revolution, and the medieval questions have returned in digital forms. Can machines develop genuine self-awareness, or are they philosophical zombies mimicking consciousness without inner experience? Virtual reality raises medieval questions about the nature of real reality. Climate change forces us to transcend human-centered thinking and find nature's intelligence beyond our projections. The medieval emergence of ego consciousness created problems we're still solving, but it also opened possibilities we're just beginning to explore. The medieval period gave humanity something unprecedented: the capacity for genuine self-reflection. This created new forms of isolation and doubt, but it also opened possibilities for conscious participation in our own evolution. Your sense of I holds paradox within it. It grants the miracle of self-awareness while sometimes blocking wider perception. The art lies in learning to dance between these possibilities rather than being trapped by either extreme. The medieval mystics discovered that ego consciousness doesn't have to be transcended in the sense of being destroyed. Instead, it can be made transparent, permeable to greater realities while maintaining its capacity for precise discrimination and choice. Every moment of self-reflection participates in the same discovery St. Augustine made 16 centuries ago. But consciousness evolution doesn't stop with self-awareness. Each stage includes and transcends what came before. The questions the medieval thinkers raised about the relationship between individual consciousness and universal truth, between reason and revelation, between ego and cosmos, these aren't historical curiosities. They're living questions that consciousness explores through each person willing to engage them seriously. What stage of consciousness wants to emerge through our contemporary world? How might ego awareness serve evolution rather than blocking it? What new synthesis of individual clarity and cosmic participation is possible? The medieval gift lives on in every moment when you catch yourself being aware of awareness itself. That capacity emerged through centuries of human struggle and insight. It's your inheritance and your responsibility. As Meister Eckhart taught, what we plant in the soil of contemplation, we shall reap in the harvest of action. The medieval seeds of self-awareness have been planted. What will consciousness grow through you? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this exploration of consciousness evolution, please consider visiting our website and supporting our research. We offer crystals, philosophy-inspired wear, and ormus. All proceeds go directly toward funding our ongoing investigations into ancient wisdom and modern understanding. Until next time, seekers.